Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Thursday, April 20th, 2023. For those of you that might be new to this format, if you're attending live, this is a format where we take live questions, also pre submitted questions. Anytime you want to ask questions, you want to send in suggestions, you want to ask for copies of content, you can email us at webinar@evoketherapy.com. So the way it goes tonight is we're going to be taking the pre-submitted questions in the order that we receive them. Also, if you're a live participant this evening, you can submit questions at any time throughout the broadcast. And Kayla and Sarah, who are moderating for me this evening, will pass those on to me in the order that they're received. So let's get to the pre-submitting questions. The first one is has a couple of parts to it, a few parts to it. So let's start. Somebody writes in, 3 years ago at age 12, we sent our son to wilderness therapy, followed by a therapeutic boarding school. His primary issues were emotional dysregulation, extreme oppositionality, mean and cruel behavior toward us and his parents, deep need for control in all situations, and resistance to any therapeutic interventions. We did our work and saw some modest progress. His behavioral issues are still very difficult, but not as intolerable as they were at the time of the out of home placement. And our own issues as parents are still present, but also less acute. Part two. Now at age 15, he has begun talking regularly about how we shipped him off and that he will never forgive us. He says he will punish us by spending less time with us when he's an adult, giving us less time with any eventual grandchildren, and providing us with less financial support in our old age than he would have had we not shipped him off. He dismissed any value of these programs and the progress we saw. He claims that he was faking compliance in order to get out of there as soon as possible. His views of the experience as purely a punishment and blames us for sending him to, quote, hell because of our own shortcomings as parents. We know this is an expression of his genuine anger and hurt, and we validate those feelings. We also know that it is an attempt to wound us or provoke us, and that we try to avoid taking the bait. And finally, we know that what he says at age 15 is a snapshot of where he is on his journey right now and not necessarily an indication of how he will view it as an adult. Still, it's very difficult to hear these things and know how to respond effectively. Any guidance you can give us about how to respond to it or to engage when he lashes out this way would be appreciated. Wonderful question. In fact, I think if I saw it correctly, we have a similar question later on in the broadcast where somebody's sharing this, and I'm actually really glad that you asked this evening. I think it's something I've been thinking about lately, especially as we've seen former students, former clients at times express similar kinds of anger. I think you already know the most important thing, which is it is a snapshot at 15 of the way that he feels right now. And I'm going to talk about the boundaries that you can set in just a minute. So I'll get to what boundaries you're allowed to set, psychologically speaking, what you have permission psychologically to set. But before I get to the boundaries, the main idea is to just apologize for the hurt and to admit the possibility that you have made a mistake. You don't have to admit to anything that is factually untrue, that you sent him there as a punishment. But there's some truth even in his anger, which is part of why we send our children to wilderness therapy is in fact due to our inadequacies, right? I think I've shared with you, if you've heard some of the old broadcasts, that when we sent my 20-year-old, now 20-year-old, to a one-on-one wilderness experience when he was 17, 16, 17, one of the things that my wife wrote in that first letter at the end of the first paragraph that I'll never forget, she said, "It's not lost on me," she wrote to him, "that we're sending you here in part to deal with issues that had something to do with what we did to you, the were a response to the ways that we parented you. So it's okay." My daughter, my 28-year-old daughter, wrote a quote that I shared a couple of years ago where she said, "The greatest gift that a parent can give a child, one of the greatest gifts that a parent can give a child, is a willingness to be cast as the villain in the child's story." The fact of the matter is, and this is the fundamental principle when children are angry at this or anything that you've done, is that we make plenty of mistakes. The more enlightened, the more aware, the more that we heal, the more we're able to see with compassion. In fact, we see them because of compassion, the mistakes that we've made in our lives. Every child experiences dents and bruises, psychologically speaking, from their parents. Every child does. There's no way not to dent and bruise your child to some extent. There's no way not to do that. What the children are resisting is this idea that they don't have a place to express their anger, their rage, their hurt, their frustration. So as we grow up and heal, as we become more adult, we allow them to feel what they feel. The greatest contribution, this goes for all of you, the greatest contribution you can make to helping your child let go of their emotions is, in fact, to not need them to let go of their emotions when you allow them to feel it. I've shared the story also where my firstborn son, my 30-year-old son, 5, 6, 7 years ago, he came to a parent meeting with me one time when we were touring and going. I was hosting a parent meeting out of town, and I brought him with me as part of his birthday present. I said, "Hey, do you want to come one of the evenings I have to work? Do you want to come to a parent meeting?" Which he said I can come to half of it. He'd already made plans, and so he came. And one of the questions that the group asked him was, "Did you have resentment for your father, for your parents, for sending you to the wilderness program?" And he was confused about it, didn't quite know how to answer it, did his best to kind of, in essence, answer, no, not really. And when he left midway through the meeting as we had planned, I said to the group, in essence, it would have been okay if he would have been angry. I wouldn't have had any resistance to that. He has a right to be angry. In fact, there are so many more mistakes that I've made. And so part of moving through it is our resistance to allowing them to feel it. There's no doubt about it, folks. No doubt about it that some of the reasons that parents send their children to the program are in some part related to the parenting issues. You can't get away from that. But what you can do is learn to forgive yourself for being human. And I want to be clear about this. When you forgive yourself for being human, that's when you allow your child to be angry. Somebody who forgives themselves, who's made peace, as I say in the subtitle of my newest book, the Learning to Love Your Horrible Rotten Self. When we make peace with our horrible rotten self, nobody can use it against us. They can be mad about it, they can be hurt by it, and we can easily say, we're sorry. It may have been a mistake. So that's the idea. Now, I promise you that I would talk about boundaries. I want to be clear about this because all of what I just said could be misunderstood to imply that you have to take it ad nauseum, that your children can yell and swear and do anything they want. You're allowed to, at any given point in time, with anybody saying, "I can't take it anymore. That's enough. I'm not willing to hear this." You're allowed to have a boundary. And what I can tell you is when you're well fed, psychologically speaking, emotionally speaking, spiritually speaking, you're going to be more able, more capable of listening to people's anger at you, even if it comes out sideways, so to speak, with a sharp edge. When you're not so well taken care of by yourself, you're going to be shorter. But the fundamental idea here is that all of our children, in fact, here's the greatest paradox of all of this. Essentially, I've said this, I've taught this for many years now. I've taught it to all of our therapists. I've said, if there was one assignment and only one assignment that we could give to our clients, our students, our participants, our young people, and of course, that's not the case. We can give them more than one assignment. But if there only was one assignment, the one of most value would be the one that children write to parents called the impact letter, where they say, here's how you hurt me. Here's what I'm angry about. Here's what I'm frustrated about. That is an exercise in giving the child a place for their feelings. We understand that mental health issues, symptoms, defenses are in part there because the child is unable or an unwilling, the person, I shouldn't say child, the person is unable or unwilling or uncomfortable, too uncomfortable to express their feelings, to feel their feelings. So the great twist in all of this is once a child goes to therapy, every decent therapeutic program in the world, every outpatient therapist in the world is going to provide a safe place, a stage for the child to express their feelings. And we're going to kind of start with the parents. You have, I have dented our children. You cannot not dent your children. And the fact of the matter is, you were dented to some degree by your parents, and they were dented to some degree by their parents, and so forth and so on. And as we heal, as we do our work, as we learn to love ourselves more and better, we don't need the defense anymore. The great minds that have walked on earth are all willing to put themselves out there and say, you can tell me when I hurt you. You can tell me of your anger, of your rage towards me. The more defended among us, the less capable, the less healed, the less insecure, or excuse me, the more insecure, the more fragile among us, and that includes all of us at some points in our lives, and then even at some points during the day, the more we want to defend ourselves, the more we want to push back, the more we see it as a threat, the more we see it as a lack of accountability on their part. And that's just not the way that it works. Our children learn by modeling, by our modeling, what it means to be human. One of my favorite quotes that I've ever shared when I talk about boundaries in the last line in my lesson on boundaries, I say, and at the end of the day, the child is going to discover the end of the limits of a parent. Every parent has limits. And the child is going to find the edges of those limits of capacity. And in that moment, when we make a mistake, we can apologize. And with this apology, the child learns perhaps the most important lesson of all. And that lesson is what it means to be human. So, yes, it's hard. Yes, it's frustrating. You have a right to set limits and boundaries about when and how people talk to you. And the work is about transformation, the work is about stretching. Remember this, our relationship with our children aren't meant to, on their surface, feed us and our ego. Ego is a word that could be best understood most simply as the need to be good or right. In fact, what we know about child development universally is that is the great wound for the child, that they feel responsible for the parent's happiness, for the parent's serenity. If you happen to go to an Al-Anon meeting or a Codependence Anonymous meeting, you would learn slogans like "My serenity is my responsibility." Slogans like "What other people think about me is none of my responsibility." I'll end with this point. This comes from a book called the Narcissistic Epidemic that I read this many years ago, 15, 20 years ago. And there was this idea that in previous generations, children worried about what parents thought about them. Which, by the way, worrying about what your parents think about you becomes the predisposing energy that leads you to codependency and peer pressure. I always say to parents, if you wonder why your child is so susceptible and vulnerable to peer pressure, is because it starts with you. If you parent like I have historically and sometimes slip up today, if you parent from a place that you tell your child how happy or disappointed or angry or frustrated or scared you are, and you do that as a primary way to manage their behavior, to offer them a moral North Star, they learn fundamentally that what other people think about them is their responsibility. So back to the story from the narcissistic epidemic. Children in previous generations worried what parents thought about them. Today, the critique is that parents worry about what children think about them, right? And it's this shaming technique that self-help experts and people in the culture use to try to shame us parents. But the fact of the matter is, it's the same person doing the worrying. If you grew up thinking that your parents' anger or them being happy or proud is about you, that wiring gets in your neurology, and you'll think that what other people think about you is about you. And when you raise children, you'll be triggered, susceptible, vulnerable to their feelings. Even though it's changed from you being the child to you being the parent, the wiring is fundamental. Children who are expected to and trained to be parent pleasers become people pleasers later in life, and then eventually become child pleasers because that's the wound. It's called the narcissistic wound. It's the wound of not being seen. So I'll say one last thing before I move on, but this is why I'm so passionate about this, because when I hear children in the world complaining to their parents about this intervention or any number of things that parents do, the urge to defend yourself is part of the dynamic. It's part of the dynamic that keeps everybody stuck. And so the work is to let go. The work is to let them feel what they're going to feel. I say this technically. I've had parents say my child is threatening to abandon me, and I say, technically speaking, children can't abandon parents. That's not the job of a child, psychologically speaking, to take care of the parents. In fact, that idea is the wound that we're treating. That's what the drama of the gifted child is. What I've said many, many times is, in my opinion, the most important book about child development. So yes, it's a great question. It's not uncommon. And you're really getting at the core issue in child psychology and child development. So thank you for asking it. And like I said, there's another one that's going to come later, I believe, that's very, very similar. I'll move on to the next question now. Somebody writes, I find it hard to have boundaries with my son who has mental and physical issues and has suffered a lot of medical trauma. I don't hold the same boundaries with him as I do my more able children. When he is rude or hurtful and inconsiderate, I fear he could become suicidal if he were to feel rejected or shamed by my boundaries. What I tend to do is try to understand the reason behind his actions, knowing how much he has suffered in the hospital and what impact this has had on his self-esteem. He is very disconnected from his feelings, though, and even just "how are you" elicits almost a shrug, at most a shrug. How do you set a boundary with someone you know is already suffering and has little resilience and means to express his pain? I don't want him to shut down completely. Part of the question, great question again. I love these questions. Part of these questions, it's the kind of questions I get in psychotherapy all the time. Some of you might be familiar, if you're a regular listener or watcher of these, with the phrase that I use that says you can't win, you can only choose how to lose. Or in the audacity to be you, I talk about this idea that you don't get to win anymore. You don't get to come out on top, but you do get to be a self. Boundaries are about self-care. Boundaries are about taking care of you. And like in the previous question, one of the reasons why I tell parents that family therapy or couples therapy for that matter is more advanced than individual therapies, because you don't get all of your needs met in a family therapy session or a couples therapy session. In a family therapy session, the parent often doesn't get very if the therapist is doing their job correctly, the parent doesn't get very many needs met at all. But even if we just split it up evenly and there's 3 of you, at best 33% of the session, one third of the session is going to be directed and aimed at taking care of your needs. Individual therapy, on the other hand, is for your needs. It is 100% to attend to what you need. There's no competing need. So individual therapy is the foundation, the basis. But back to your question, um, you don't get to decide how he reacts. And of course, we have to take into consideration each child's individual need. Right? There are children with neurodiversity. There are children with mental health diagnoses. There are children with physical disabilities, with varying levels of trauma, and that becomes part of the equation. And so the job is to figure out, how can I take care of myself? What do I need to do to take care of myself? And almost inevitably, you guys, almost inevitably, the thing that you're going to be up against when you're thinking about self-care is guilt. That's the thing that we have to grapple with. That's the thing that therapy helps you to battle effectively. And sometimes, and I essentially I think about my relationship with my children, although it's, yeah, I love him as much as I, as a human being, am capable of loving, is how much I love my children. And if you're like me, and most parents are, that especially parents who attend and listen to things like this podcast, this broadcast, most of them are attuned to the fact that their children are their greatest sources of joy in their life in a big and a meaningful way. But day to day, it's not for you. So you have to get your needs taken care of some other place, some other way. You have to carve out other times in your life where you get validated, not by them. You get heard and seen, and definitely not by them. You get energy in, right? So that when you show up to the child, you can, in essence, be more available to them. And when you can't, again, I asked my therapist this many years ago, and I consider my therapist literally a genius, the most gifted person ever in psychotherapy. And I asked her several years ago about this idea about being all capable for our children. She explained, children don't need us to be all capable. If they did, they would all be doomed, because none of us are all capable, have all patience, have all compassion, have all energy. But what they need us to do is own our limitations. And what most parents do, what my mother did, and most parents do, is instead of owning their limitations, they make us the problem. And the difference sounds like this: owning it sounds like, I can't do this. I'm not willing to do this. I need a timeout. I need to take care of myself. I'm not going to be home. I'm going to be at a meeting. I'm going to be unavailable. Your mother and I, your father and I are going on vacation. I'm going on vacation. That's what it sounds like. That's what a human parent sounds like. Owning it. But most of us want to say, when the child is triggering us, when the child is too much, and whatever that means, we say, you're the problem. You're too demanding. You're too needy. We say it with our bodies, with our feelings. We make them the problem instead of owning our own humanity, our humanness, our limitations. Your child can deal with a human parent because that's what they have. But what they don't deal with well, what really crushes them, is believing that they're the problem, believing that they're responsible for hurting or overwhelming the parent, the person who loves them the most. And that feeling is shame. It's, I'm bad, something's wrong with me. That becomes the critical inner voice that 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 gets into them and becomes a part of why they get in toxic relationships, abusive relationships, self-medicating, addictive behaviors, all of that stuff. So our job is to own our humanness, own our stuff, own our limitations. And over time, with work, as we get better at grappling with guilt, we develop more capacity. I have more capacity in some ways, in many ways, less physical energy, of course, but more psychological capacity and breadth and depth today at 55 years old than I did at 35 years old and 25 years old when I had my first child. And that expansion, that growth, that enlargement is a part of relationships, is a part of marriage, and is a part of parenting. It is an outcome of our psychological, spiritual, emotional work and growth. So, thank you for those questions. All right, next one comes in. Part one. I appreciate your insight. I remember one of your podcasts, you mentioned that parents could just say they were sorry when their child blames them for all the things that have occurred in their lives. For example, being sent to wilderness or being sent to a therapeutic boarding school. This is the question I remember receiving that's similar to the first one. Our son is 18 and a senior. He may or may not graduate high school. He's accepted into a college, but is dragging his feet on orientation, etc. We are not pushing him to go to college, but we are encouraging him to graduate high school. Our son believes that he would have been a star football player going to college if we had not taken him out of high school and moved him to a private school, and then he went to Wilderness Center Therapeutic Boarding School. The way he was behaving, this is not necessarily accurate, of course. Right now, he's in a public high school, and we gave him the option, despite the educational consultant recommending that he go to a private, faraway place. Part two to the question. He's doing okay, but is lately upset at not being able to move forward and keeps thinking we failed him and that he can't decide what to do, is my guess. Now he wants to do some fighting, boxing career, and believes he thinks that and believes we think he should go to college, even though we have told him that he just needs to have a job to live at home once he graduates. He seems to enjoy these types of sports, maybe because he is angry about his life and being adopted. I think he needs to talk his way through it with a professional, but he will not. My husband said he would not say sorry. He would not say that he is sorry for anything, as that will just make our son unaccountable for his part and why he moved from home. I tried to explain how to say he was sorry without taking on our son's accountability, but I think I need your help in exactly what to say to our son. I understand the concern my husband has since our son does blame others for responsibilities. Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Very similar to the earlier question. You know, one of my favorite examples, I've told this before, when a mother, she had a son who historically was a pleasing son, a dishonest son, because he didn't fight, as I like to say, going through the front door. He went around the side door or the back door. He was avoidant. He was a pleaser on the surface, but he would lie. And at one point, when things were coming to a head where he was acting out and getting caught, and the parents brought me in to help. The goal was help us with our son at home so he doesn't have to go to a program like yours. And I sat there at the session just prior to the parents deciding to send him to a wilderness program. I sat there, and the son expressed very clear anger and rage at his parents, blaming them for being judgmental of friends, being judgmental coming from a conservative religious lens, judgmental of his friends, the way they looked. And he said words like, "You made me a liar. I had no choice but to lie and to hide. And I'm this way because of you." And I was watching this and waiting to see how the parents would respond. I hadn't coached them on this issue prior. And the mother talked first, and she said, "You're right. I did judge. I did I did do those things." And I was waiting for the but, or for the father to jump in this case. And I had that lecture in my head queued up, just like as you hear the story, you probably do, saying, "Well, yes, she did that, and you're still responsible for lying." Like, I had that ready. That's the common thing that I imagine most people would be ready to say. And the session, that the family session ended, and he left, and I was sitting there with the parents, and the mother said, "Yes, but Brad, how do we emphasize his accountability? How do we teach him to be accountable for his part of it?" And my answer was, "You just did." See, the need to be right or good is ego, and children learn that from us. My children have learned that from me, and my unwillingness to apologize and take accountability. They have grown up in a family where, because of my ego and my wife's ego, which, another way of looking at our unhealed trauma, we've been able to say we're sorry and that we're wrong. I was thinking about this question because I saw it coming earlier in the week. The fact of the matter is, forget this specific decision to pull him out of high school, which you're justified, clinically speaking. Forget that specific decision. You've hurt your child in numberless ways. You've snapped, you've lost patience, you've lectured, you've dismissed, you've gaslit them, you've told them not to feel what they're feeling. Every parent does that. So if you don't want to apologize for this thing, make the list of 1,000 other things that you could apologize for. When we get into the mindset of who's more right, and you need to admit you're wrong first, and I don't want to apologize because then that removes your accountability. That kind of zero sum game is the problem. So I don't know what to do to encourage your husband. I don't know what lever to flip, what key to turn to help him see this, except for to say, this is what healthy, healed, evolved parents do. They have accountability, but it goes two ways. I have hurt my children. And even though two of my children have gone to wilderness, one went to a traditional, my oldest went to the traditional wilderness program. My 20-year-old, my third child, we created a customized one for him. But that's just one of an infinite practically number of decisions that we've made. I have issues. And the reason that I can say that is because I've gone to therapy and I've made peace with my fallibility, which is consistently fallible. Right? That's what healing does is you don't need to be something else. You don't need to be without fault or without contribution. The Journey of the Heroic Parent, my first book, the title, the hero in mythology is the person who's willing to go inward, to look at themselves, to kill the ego. I used to give this silly analogy. It's somewhat dated now, but for our age, it'll be relevant. I used to say to kids in the wilderness, I said, if you walked up to Tupac, and even at the time that I shared it, Tupac had already died. But I said, if you walked up to the rapper Tupac, and you saw him in the hallway at a casino, and you called him an asshole or an idiot, what do you think would happen? And every student that I ever had said you'd probably be thrown up against the wall by one of his posse, by one of his security, maybe even by him, and threatened with bodily harm. And I said, yeah, that's probably what would happen. And if you walked up to Gandhi and called him an idiot, what do you think would happen? And they didn't really know. And I said, luckily, we have examples where that did happen. Gandhi wasn't perfect. He admits to making lots of mistakes, specifically in his marriage. But if you walked up and called him an idiot, his response would be, in essence, what did I do to hurt you? I must have done something. I'm sorry. And I can remember specific clients that I've worked with telling them this exact example that I've used, having such resistance, and years later in their work saying, it's obvious to me now. When you accept yourself, nobody can use your faults against you because they're just true. When you haven't accepted yourself and when you're still clinging to this hopes that you're going to be good enough and justified and not the problem, of course you're going to defend yourself. So I don't know what's going to help your husband. Maybe love, maybe patience, maybe grace, maybe compassion, maybe a model. Maybe it will get so bad with his son that he'll be willing to try something different. But to sit there in a power struggle, convinced that of the one idea that you are committed to, which is it's the other person's problem, this is what wars are fought over. This is what people do, how they act. And I speak from personal experience, who haven't done their work, who haven't healed, who haven't seen beyond. This mathematical zero sum game is what gets people stuck. And sometimes fathers can be mothers also. Sometimes fathers, because they haven't been taught, they haven't had vulnerability modeled for them to embrace their humanness. Their defenses are fairly pristine, fairly rigid, well armored up. The nine rusty armor is a good allegory about the kind of work that we have to do to get through it. We have to come to terms with ourselves, and that takes courage. And sometimes the courage is born out of a crisis, and maybe it hasn't been bad enough for your husband to be willing to try something different. So I'm sorry for you and for your son. Another very long question in 4 parts, I believe. Part 1, this is a long question, and it is about antisocial personality disorder, which I know is relatively rare. I wonder if you could direct me to any reading material or other sources you think are particularly insightful on this topic. I am, by the way, so grateful to have had your podcast to listen to over the past couple of years, and want to thank you for the incredible resource. I was listening to episode 526 of the podcast. What is the work, and how do we do it? And something just jumped out at me, and I wanted to ask you about it. You quoted Jung and then spoke about how being conscious of the cause of one's complexes is not enough. It's just knowing, it's experiencing, and that can lead a person to change. Insights and tools help, but a key to growth is feeling better about yourself. This is my question. In the case of someone diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, for those of you who don't know, it's similar to what people talk about when they talk about sociopathology. Historically, psychopath, sociopath, it's somebody who lacks empathy, somebody who doesn't have the ability to respond empathically to others, sees others as objects, can commit crimes and do horrible things to others without seemingly any sense of remorse or guilt. Keep going. In the case of someone diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, it seems like the only possibility of that person changing is if they come to intellectually understand to behave in the ways that they are drawn to behave, i.e., stealing as an example, is hurtful to others, and then decide again on an intellectual level that for some reason they are motivated to change their behavior. I'm wondering how this can be reconciled, or if it can be reconciled, with your observation that we don't change based on recognizing our childhood traumas on an intellectual level, or by seeing how our current behaviors have come from those traumas. If we can only change when we feel we want to change, and if this is what a person with antisocial personality disorder typically cannot do, how can that person ever change? In a different episode of a podcast, I heard you explain an incredible, helpful way about how antisocial personality might evolve in a person. You talked about how someone suffering with the pain of their childhood traumas might reach a point where they cannot tolerate their feelings anymore and might essentially turn off their own feelings for relief from their suffering. In doing so, though, they also turn off their feelings for others as well and their ability to truly empathize. This makes a lot of sense to me as a story of how we may have gotten to where we are. I wonder if you have any analogous wisdom about how a person might move through this or even come out the other side or at least come to a better place. Finally, I realize I have no control over my now 18-year-old kid's struggles. I have very little influence either. I would be so grateful to hear any thoughts and any case studies that you might have to be able to share about how people can overcome or potentially overcome this particular disorder. I am, by the way, doing my own absolute essential work in therapy and Al Anon. Just wanted to mention this, is I know it would be a suggestion that you have. Wonderful. The way that you help people build empathy is to teach them how to feel. That's the antidote, if you will. But the first step with any disorder, especially one that is a personality disorders like antisocial personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder or others, are particularly resistant to treatment because we think of them as hardwired in the brain. So the first step, and this is true of everybody on every level, even those without personality disorders, is to be honest with yourself. And that can happen in situations. It's most likely to happen when there's compassion. Now, with antisocial personality disorders, one of the recommendations that leads to the individual being willing to treat it is having incorruptible authority figures. Authority figures that are clear and incorruptible. We don't have a lot of places for that in society. A really good treatment program, a really good one, is as close as we can get. Prisons don't work, right? Um, Sometimes a tragedy, again, can help somebody. Sometimes going to prison, I've worked with prisoners before. Sometimes going to prison can be the impetus to being willing to look at it. But essentially, what you're asking the person to do is to feel the unfelt feelings of their entire life. Because once they let down that wall, those things come flooding through, flooding in. So, as somebody who loves them, boundaries and patience and compassion are the ingredients, and a sense of a realization of powerlessness. I mean, a healthy powerlessness, like, I can't control this. I've thought about this with a couple of questions tonight, and you already said it. Um, the fundamental idea that I talk about and that I teach is that the basis upon which all other ideas are built or rest is you doing your work, which you knew that I would talk about. But it's a lifelong endeavor. So when I've seen successful movement with somebody with antisocial personality disorder, it's when they accepted and understood the diagnosis. I had one student, again, it's very rare, who was heading in that direction. And one of the things he said to me is, I want to live alone. I want to live remotely. I want to be safe. I want to live alone, but I want to live remotely because I don't trust myself. I don't trust my instincts. The It doesn't happen in a moment. It doesn't happen in a session. It doesn't happen in a year. But what I've learned, and I'll talk about the readings in just a moment. What I've learned is that the instinct that we have when somebody lacks empathy is to try to shove empathy down their throat. Don't you see how you hurt people? Don't you see how you're affecting other people? And the fact of the matter is, that's not the way that it works. They have to learn how to feel. See, like you're referring to a broadcast. As human beings, we essentially see other people as the same animal that we are, essentially, fundamentally. And so if we are non-feeling beings, then other people are non-feeling beings. If I had to cut off my feelings because I had experienced chronic trauma or abuse, if I learned to be numb, to turn myself into an object because that's the way that I was treated or that's the way that I survived, then I'm not hurting a person. It's like it'd be the same as hurting a rock. Pounding a chisel on a rock in a dirt field wouldn't cause anybody to feel remorse. And that's the way it is for somebody with this level of pathology, this level of wiring. So you teach them how to feel. I Back to the reading. I mean, the hard part about this work is somebody wrote me a question today on my social media and asked me about a specific diagnosis, a specific pattern of behavior. And they said, I know that all that you talk about applies to this, but do you have any specific things you've written on this narrow subject? And I said, I really don't, because the longer I've been a clinician, the longer I've been a client, the more general I've become. Meaning that I talk about how human beings are built from the ground up. So I don't have any off the top of my head. Raising Cain was a book that we used to use years ago that you could take a look at about children and boys, and in particular, who lose feeling. But essentially, the way that I see the work is, although I don't have antisocial personality disorder, I can see myself in it, right? I don't have narcissistic personality disorder, but I can see myself in it. I wrote once that in graduate school, one of the things that happens to graduate students who are studying psychotherapy and psychology is they get to that class where you have to study the diagnostic manual, and they start to panic with anxiety because they see themselves in all of the diagnoses, and the professors are quick to assuage their anxiety by saying, no, it's more severe, that doesn't really fit you. But wiser professors say, and have said, good, you know what it's like. You know what it's like to treat somebody. You're a little bit like them. You're not as far, but you're a little bit like them. That's what I read this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm doing a post about this, the Buddhist monk, and he said this. I want to read this to you because it's applicable. It's really applicable to the question that's being asked today. Thich Nhat Hanh said this. He said, continue practicing until you see yourself in the most cruel and inhumane political leader, in the most devastatingly tortured prisoner, in the wealthiest man, in the child starving, all skin and bones. Practice until you recognize your presence in everyone else on the bus, in the subway, in the concentration camp, working in the fields, in a leaf, in a caterpillar, in a dewdrop, in a ray of sunshine. Meditate, or in this case, do your work, until you see yourself in a speck of dust in the most distant galaxy. The more work that I've done, the more I see myself in all the diagnoses. I think I've shared that when I worked with prisoners who were convicted of sexual abuse and assault early in my career, I walked into the job arrogant, thinking to myself, well, I can help these guys. They're obviously less than me. That was the attitude I had walking in. And after listening to some of the stories, I was humbled and terrified because I realized I haven't done what they've done, but I'm way more like them than feels comfortable. So you don't have to study sociopathology specifically to understand it. You have to study what it means to be a healthy, whole human. That's what Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about. And he arrived at it from the place of Buddhism and meditation, but it's the same thing. That's what Jung talks about and Freud talked about. That's what the greats talk about. So those are some of the ideas. I don't have a lot of books. Um, a lot of this training came from sitting at the feet of a master therapist, Jamie Gill. Anything that she's written, anything that James Hollis has written, anything that Alice Miller has written. Um, you can go farther and even look at Jung and anything that he's written, but it's a little bit more complex. Anything that Joseph Campbell has written, and then the list goes on from there. Robert Bly is a great author. James Hillman is a great scholar. Right there are D.W. Winnicott, Donald Winnicott is a great author. Melanie Klein. These are people that weren't like we see in America today specifically, uh, narrowly looking at the human psyche and trying to solve a specific symptom. But they were understanding how human beings are built. Read Rumi, right? Read Rilke. You read these great minds. Khalil Gibran, read Khalil Gibran. You read these great minds and you start to see it's all the same thing. Everything, everywhere, all at once. That's the message. That's the message of that movie. So I'm sorry I can't specifically respond with more detailed readings, and I'm sure there's great ones out there. I'm sure some of the great minds have looked at it and written and specifically written to it, but they focus on on the human psyche and how it's built and how it breaks and what it looks like when it breaks. Somebody writes, can you explain solo? So this will be my last question. Wow, this is the easier one of the questions for this evening, so it's a good one to end on. Solos are a 48 to 72 hour experience in our wilderness therapy program where when they're clinically cleared by the therapist, they are set out on a solo site. They are asked to stay awake during the day. They can go to sleep when the sun goes down. We don't give them a lot of assignments. We don't fill their time up with reading and writing, and we just want them to spend time with themselves to feel. We come by and check on them. We make sure that they're within earshot. So if there's an emergency, they can call our name. We've never had any serious incidences of physical harm in our 25 years. So it's like wilderness therapy. It's time to spend time with yourself, only more, right? Because I'm going to write a post. That's where that Thich Nhat Hanh quote comes in. I'm going to write a post in the next couple of days on my social media about the relationship with ourselves as the basis for all of our other relationships. And I'm going to borrow from Buddhists, from the Bible, from Islam, from science, from Native American philosophy, because the message is consistent. The relationship we have with ourselves becomes the template for all other relationships. And it's not just one unique school of thought. The deep divers in all the spiritual practices and all the psychological fields have realized the same conclusion. That's why we work on ourselves first and foremost. So solos are a time to spend time with yourself and see how you like the company. One of my favorite quotes from a guru is to say that the ability to spend time with yourself is the predetermining factor about whether you can be effective in intimacy in a partnership. And that makes sense even on a simple logical level. What gets in our ways in relationships is that we fear of being rejected, of being judged, of being abandoned. And when being abandoned or left to yourself is not thought of as a great disastrous threat, you reduce the nervous system's response. You downregulate. You can stay more present during conflict. You can become less reactive to criticism. So solos is a time for us to give them a ritual, an experience. A lot of cultures have used this kind of thing where they send young people out by themselves. Send them out into the wilderness to find themselves. That's what this is about. Some clients love it, some hate it. If they have the good fortune to have two experiences, the first one and the second one can be and feel very different to them. We come by and check on them several times. They have parameters, an area that they're supposed to stay close to. They leave a little a note for the staff when they come by, but the staff check on them randomly throughout the day. And like I said, they are close enough that if they have an emergency, they're instructed to call their name. And then if anybody else hears that name being called, like the name Brad, then everybody else calls the name Brad, and staff know exactly where to go because they've drawn a map for where the kids are. We find a place where we can keep them relatively close, but they can't see or talk to each other. So that's what solos are. It's a rite of passage within a rite of passage, and it's beautiful. I'll just end with this moment. I've heard comedians talk about this idea that we are so unwilling to sit with our own thoughts. I mean, that's part of why we self-medicate. And our phones are the ultimate self-medication, right? You pull up to a stoplight, and we're so uncomfortable with being by ourselves for 45 seconds, for 60 seconds that we check our phones. because we don't want to be alone with our own thoughts and our own feelings. So solos is a ritual, a rite of passage to give people that experience of sitting with themselves and coming. They don't have to like themselves. We just want them to know how they feel about themselves. And if they don't like themselves and if they are uncomfortable, that's just as instructive as if for them it's a very peaceful experience. So that's what solos are. All right, folks, great questions for this evening. Let me go through the upcoming announcements and then we'll wrap up on time. If you want to get your cameras ready, for those of you that are watching live, you can face your cameras at the screen at the QR code, and that will take you to the respective web page. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. I narrated the second one. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, I cannot think of something that is a better contribution to the health of your family, of your children, than coming to an intensive. I believe in it. I stand by it. Personally, I've sent family, friends. We have several of our therapists and our managers. My business partners have gone to them. I believe in them. And we've all paid full price. Just to be clear, we paid to go somewhere else. So I believe in it. May 17th is the next offering for an in-person Finding You. We also have an online version. May 19th is the next offering for that. You can go to our webpage and find other dates if those times don't work for you. The online one is half the time and about a third of the cost, and you don't have to travel. We started it during COVID, and I was so impressed with its effectiveness that we're going to continue doing it for those where that's a better option for them. If you want to come back and you've already been to a Finding You or even been to a second one, Returning to You is that option. October 11th is our offering. I'm also doing a Finding You weekend in the UK. There may be one spot left. You can check by emailing intensives@evoketherapy.com. We have customized private intensives for couples and family. Finding Connection and Finding Family are those offerings. So you can go to, like I said, go to our webpage or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. We have support groups for current and alumni families. The next one is April 27th. We have them once a week. April 27th at 6:30 p.m. 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an alumni only meeting. April 25th is the next offering for that at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an intensive alumni group held online May 9th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Contact Sarah D, SARAD, at evoketherapy.com or go to evoketherapy.com/family involvement for more information about our support groups. If you want to coach someone who's been trained in the attachment, the evoke model, we have coaches for couples, individuals. You can think about it as an opportunity to learn boundaries. If you have a child coming home, for transitioning families, anything you would use a coach for to help you psychologically navigate some of these waters. Coaching at evoketherapy.com is the place to go for that. We ask all current parents to just try 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of alanon.org, coda.org, familiesanonymous.org, or adultchildren.org. Also, refugerecovery.org and the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, have free classes and resources in your area. Those can also be helpful to you. All of these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just go there and search Finding You and Evoke Therapy podcast. Subscribe, give us a rating, give us feedback. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer and listen there, or you can go to Evoke's YouTube channel and you can watch the rebroadcast of all of these with the slides and the video. You can find Evoke Therapy programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles @Evoke Therapy and @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. Or you can go to Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has wonderful content created each week by our staff and therapists. If you want to give back to people that can't afford treatment, if you feel so inspired, our 3 charitable partners include ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, and the EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. You can earmark your funds, your donation for a specific population or profile of a client, or even for a specific program. My next broadcast will be April 25th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, how to find a therapist, one of my very favorite topics to talk about. All right, folks, thanks for joining me this evening. I hope this is a helpful point of contact for all of you watching, all of you listening on the podcast apps. And for and on behalf of the people that love you and the people that you love, thank you for showing up and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.